Apologies in advance if anyone is offended by my point, but all excitement on her face, whose R's they protected for a long time. The Yorkshire accent, cry with agony. As young as 5, no clue of his backdoor offences. £40 million in charity. I mean, straight up, a rat of the Pied Piper. What were you thinking? I'm not blaming the victims, the greatest ironies of all ironies. Hey everyone, the Dark Knaik is here. The Reckoning is a 4-episode BBC One docu-drama miniseries based on the life of Jimmy Savile. If you are a British, the man needs no introduction. And those who don't know, let me brief you. Jimmy Savile was a popular DJ who later became a well-known figure when he joined the BBC, where he hosted Top of the Pops and Jim'll Fix It. He was heavily involved in charity work, and his undoubtedly biggest achievement was raising £40 million in charity for different medical institutes. With this humanitarian effort came his name much into prominence and stood shoulder to shoulder with Margaret Thatcher and the royal family. This iconic figure, who actually became one of the most beloved, respectful, heroic, and a godly figure in Britain's 20th century, had kept all of them happy for 60 years. But almost a year after his death, the world realized that there is a small part of the world to whom he also made cry with agony. Investigations proved to everyone's massive shock that this Jimmy Savile had sexually abused and assaulted more than 500 people, mostly underaged. As young as 5, Jimmy Savile, once Britain's beloved icon, turned out to be a serial sexual abuser, rapist, and a pedophile. When Jimmy Savile's victims showed up one after the other, and the world got to know the truth that Savile had been raping children and teenagers for more than 50 years, so many questions were risen on different organizations and institutes, especially the broadcasting giant, the BBC. This pervert gave 4 decades to the BBC. It is impossible to assume that such an organization had no clue of his backdoor offenses. They of course knew what he was doing, and there was no stopping at all. That builds an opinion, that builds a theory, that the BBC protected Jimmy Savile's legacy. They protected his arse. But after his death, the damage on BBC's legacy was done. Hence, the BBC came up with this show. And I must say that this move has to be one of the greatest media ironies of all ironies. I would like to quote Pragya Agarwal, who wrote in one of her articles for The Independent about this show. It also feels insidiously callous and thoughtless that an organization that played a role in glorifying a sex offender and profiting from him, the BBC, while covering up his actions for many decades, are once again capitalizing on his brand and the fascination that viewers have with monsters and true crime. I mean, straight up, I was excited that a show on Jimmy Savile was finally announced. But I was very surprised that none other than BBC was funding the project. But after watching it, I must say that the BBC has painted different shades. The BBC shows his true colours and also dramatises that how BBC was fooled by this man. They even showed us that Jimmy Savile was not even considered for Jimmy Fix-It because of his mysterious personality. Throughout the show, you will notice that the BBC keeps popping, and one can convincingly declare it to be intentional. Like I said before, that it is ironic that the BBC produced a show on someone whose arts they protected for a long time. No doubt it is either brave or foolish to fund a project. So their side of the story has to be wildly clear that how and why they protected Jimmy Savile. Instead, BBC portrays themselves that they had no clue about his crimes due to lack of evidences. That makes them more naive. Due to the nature of the show being a miniseries, each episode begins and ends with 4 real-life Jimmy Savile victims, with their names altered for obvious reasons. Moreover, their narrative has all been dramatized in the show. Not that the other victims got unrecognized, but in a limited capacity, I will take these 4 cases as the representation of all the cases. For sure, no medium can cover the cases of all the victims at all. Despite being a show about a sex predator, there is no nudity or rape scenes at all. And I'm okay with the show for not shooting those haunting moments of the victims, obviously to maintain respect and solidarity with those who suffered. The makers handled the sensitive content very well. Some of the scenes were very impactful. I like the one where Jimmy Savile takes the kid into his office and then the kid realizes that something horrible is about to happen. The very next scene, a frame shows up that says, "Jim fixed it for me." Okay, now a sensitive point. Apologies in advance if anyone is offended by my point, but I would like to understand this. I do not wish to harm the victims of all ages and time, but something that disturbs me about not the predator, but the teenagers, the teenage victims. Immense blindness of being a rat of the Pied Piper. The dramatization depicts that young girls followed him to his home. How come did you not sense that you were not entering to someone's place without a guardian, but into a danger zone? How could you trust a stranger to an extent to visit to his place? Why didn't you check your parents or any guardian at all that this man was inviting you to his home? There is a scene where a girl literally visits with him to his residence with all excitement on her face until Jimmy Savile locks the door. That brings her back to her senses. What were you thinking? What were you thinking when you were going with him? That grandpa is going to feed you with a shepherd's pie? I'm not blaming the victims for all the horrors this man has inflicted. I'm reasoning your stupidity that gave him the advantage. We all are very familiar to this great actor and comedian, Steve Coogan. A versatile like him has played so many different roles in his career. He must be praised for being bold enough to play the role of Jimmy Savile and face the heat. I'll say that he took the chance because he knew that this particular role is going to garnish his filmography, and there could have been no better actor than Steve Coogan to play this role. When the show begins and the moment when Steve Coogan voices Jimmy Savile, my eyebrows rise in surprise, and I'm taken aback when Steve Coogan acts Jimmy Savile.
But why should I tell all to you, a Johnny from London, whom I've never set eyes on before?
The mannerism, the eccentric persona.
Leeds ain't seen nothing yet, sweetheart, and may I say how très enchanté I am to meet such a delightful young lady. Young lady. Oh.
The Yorkshire accent, the way he smokes his cigar, were all well caught up. I never felt a vocal difference between Steve Coogan and Jimmy Savile in the show. Perhaps it was a piece of cake for him because he's from Lancashire and Jimmy Savile was from Yorkshire, and if I'm not wrong, both the accents are quite similar. But one edge of impression was missing in Steve Coogan. I hope anyone also noticed that. The missing part is eyes. Eyes in Steve Coogan's face. Those big, wide Jimmy Savile eyes. It's badly missing throughout the show. Those naughty eyes of some dirty old man. There was no craziness on his face. The whole time, due to cold facial expressions, he, in his white hair, looked like old version of Mo Howard. But if this show becomes successful or well known in the coming time, that is only because of Steve Coogan. It was a fabulous performance. I never felt throughout the show for once that Steve Coogan was starring in this show, but Jimmy Savile himself. He was that excellent. Brilliant performance. Must I believe that BBC has done a favor by making this mini-series and somehow made an effort clearing their name? Not at all. Not at all. The reckoning is not at all reckoning. It is about the rise and fall of Jimmy Savile. And while he was grabbing all that national attention for decades, he was also grabbing and raping many children and teenagers. BBC installed some episodic moments of the times of his going pervert and committing crimes. There were more insights in the Netflix documentary than this. I hardly discovered anything new from this show. I must also praise the BBC that one major pull on Savile's intentions was rightly handled, which, as a matter of fact, is dogmatizing that the entire humanitarian effort by Jimmy Savile in his lifetime was for the cover-up of his crimes. The question mark over his humanitarian efforts was raised several times in the show, which means that BBC now finally, but behind closed doors, admit that funding and shielding this man is a permanent damage to their legacy. BBC will never go down. The BBC will never shut down for sure. But this Jimmy Savile chapter, no matter how many justifications they provide to the audience, will hurt them. I'm Samir.
Personally, I wouldn't touch him with a barge pole.